Welcome to Standard 3C. In this presentation, we'll take a look at a piece of technology called the printing press and assess its role in changing cultural values, traditions, and philosophies during the Reformation. Some essential understanding for this presentation. We want to understand that at the time of the Reformation, power in almost all forms, including religious power, was concentrated in the monarch. And by monarch we mean the king or the queen. We see here in the picture up here on the right, this is the Spanish king and queen Ferdinand and Isabella. We'll see them again in the Age of Exploration as the king and queen who send Columbus out exploring and discovering the Americas. But they, as king and queen, made it a point to assert their religious power. They wanted Spain to be a Catholic nation. And anybody who wasn't Catholic really was unwelcome in Spain during their rule. Jews, Muslims, anyone who's non-Catholic were expelled and kicked out of Spain during their rule. So it was a time where you were expected to follow the religion of the ruler. The idea we have today where the political rulers have fairly little, if any, control over a religious life, that was still a long ways away. If the ruler decided to change religion and become something else, you were expected to change your religion as well. As a result of this, we do see a Europe in the time of the Reformation that was very much divided along religious lines. We see, for example, as we mentioned in Spain, if you weren't Catholic in Spain, you really weren't welcome. You had tension here in France between Catholics and Protestants. We see the Spanish Armada in the late 1500s sent from Catholic Spain to try and conquer Protestant England. We see Protestant England begin a series of wars against its Catholic neighbor Ireland, which extend for centuries. So in other words, those different colors on the map representing the different religions, they're going to also represent religious intolerance. These countries didn't like, or these groups didn't like, that the other groups existed. And some of these groups are going to make it their business to make life miserable for the other groups, or to even try and defeat the other groups. So we see a lot of bloodshed and violence during this period. However, over time, religious toleration emerged. And as we see in our vocabulary for this unit, toleration is understanding and acceptance of ideas different from your own. I picked for this picture here, this is actually the town where my dad is from in Ireland, a country and an area which knew a large degree of religious intolerance and fighting and bloodshed. Today we see in the modern day town, we see the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, and they sit right across the street from each other. And on Sundays, people of both religions come out roughly the same time, to their cars that are parked on the street, and no religious violence occurs. In other words, the two groups have learned to, if not be real happy that the other group exists, they at least put up with and tolerate the existence of the other group. So we're going to see what the role of the printing press was in that occurrence. Okay, so our essential question for this part of the presentation was, what was the role of the printing press? And the printing press was invented by a guy named Johann Gutenberg. One of our themes in history is the role that technology plays in historical events and changing perceptions and ideas. History 500 years from now might take a look at our phones. Okay, and some of you are really too young to even realize the change that technology has had in our lives. But for people like myself and your parents, we're very much aware that The computer, the phone, all of our technology, our communication devices have really changed so much about society, changed the way we live, the way we communicate, things that I couldn't have even thought of when I was a high school student. Okay, never heard of a cell phone. Make me sound like I'm really old, but those things have really changed our lives, and the technology that changed life dramatically around the time of the Reformation was the printing press, invented by Johann Gutenberg. This was not a completely new idea. Printing had been around in various forms for centuries. We see here printing blocks used in China for mass producing or standardizing print. In Europe at the time, before the Reformation, before Gutenberg's printing press, if you wanted a book made, if you wanted a number of copies of something made, it was handwritten. And we see here monks handwriting copies of the Bible. Okay, and you can just picture how long it would take, whether it's a Bible or a textbook or even a Harry Potter book, how long it would take to create if you had to handwrite that book out by hand and not with a machine. The printing press that Gutenberg invents, it wasn't a completely new idea as we see, but he was able to take that idea of movable type that the Chinese had and put it in a machine, and put it in what was actually a press for making olive oil was the original framework that he used, but the ability to then line up the letters, slap some ink on them, and print as many copies as you wanted. That was a huge change. Prior to Gutenberg's printing press, if you wanted a large amount of information spread to other people, you needed to deliver that verbally. If Martin Luther wanted to write out the 95 Theses, he would have been writing out all 95 of those points 100 times if he wanted 100 copies. You could picture he'd be getting a cramped hand and maybe even decide it wasn't worth it. Now with the printing press, though, we're going to see that much more easily done. What we see here on these maps is the spread of the printing press from Mainz, Germany, where Gutenberg invents the printing press. In 1450, that was the only place you could find a printing press. Okay, we see our maps progress here in 20-year increments. Here by 1470, the printing press is spread to a lot more cities throughout Europe. And by 1490, here we are almost 30 years before Martin Luther, now we see the printing press very widely spread. I could almost make a scatter plot like this for cell phones. I could go back, and the top map would be the number of students in a class who had a cell phone 10 years ago. And our middle map would be the number of students with a cell phone 5 years ago. And now in the present day, this would be the number of students. That piece of technology spread very rapidly. And we see the printing press in the 14 into the 1500s do very much the same. Okay, so as we mentioned, we have three essential pieces of knowledge here about the printing press. The first is that, as we mentioned, it really helps to spread the ideas of the Reformation and the Renaissance. Books like Machiavelli's The Prince, Thomas More's Utopia, things like Martin Luther's 95 Theses, they could be printed over and over and over again and spread much more rapidly than could be done before. To put it in modern terms, we think about Twitter, we think about YouTube, and the things that allow videos, people's thoughts to be spread immediately. 20 years ago, again, there were much more limited options if people wanted to spread their ideas, their thoughts to other people. So the printing press helps to spread the ideas of the Renaissance and the Reformation. We also see the large-scale printing of the Bible in what are called the vernacular. Before the Reformation, the Bible was only printed in Latin. Latin was the official language of the church. one of the issues Luther and other Protestants had with the Catholic Church was they believed that the Bible should be in the language of the people. Okay, so if the Bible was being read by people in England, the Bible should be printed in English. If it was going to be printed in France, it should be in French, Germany, and German, and so forth. The vernacular is your everyday language. Okay, so Luther and the Protestants tended to feel, why learn another language just to read the Bible? Okay, when it was just being handwritten by the monks could control what language they were writing it in. Now with the printing press, it was much harder to control that. The Bible could be printed in numerous languages, not just Latin. Okay, we also see the growth of literacy, and literacy is the ability to read. The printing press made books much quicker to print. Okay, you could produce books more quickly, which led to more books being made, and the more of anything that there is, the cheaper that thing is. So books which had been very rare and very expensive when written by hand became very plentiful. Okay, and we see the ability to read, or literacy, increase. Again, the reason you're able to read probably is because you had lots of these when you were little, okay, produced very cheaply lying around the house that you could practice reading with. Okay, that hasn't always been the case historically. Reading was an ability only the privileged few had. Okay, but now with the printing press, the growth of literacy. Okay, we see it here in this chart showing the illiteracy rate, the opposite of literacy in France. We see almost 70% of people in France not able to read in 1720. As the printing press spread and books became more numerous, by 1885 that's down under 10%, and today would be, probably close to 1% illiteracy. 99% of people in the developed world are literate, able to read. Okay, we also have some changing cultural values that the Reformation and the printing press create. Okay, the first of these is a growth of what we call secularism, and secularism is a more worldly way of thinking. Before the Reformation, religious thinking and daily life were almost completely together. Okay, and secular means we kind of have, as we see on the signs here, religion or church and state politics kind of on different paths. Okay, the two things aren't the same today, and that's what we call secularism. Okay, another one that we have is the growth of individualism. Prior to the printing press and the Reformation, you as an individual wasn't as important as you as the member of a group. Okay, with the widespread ideas, the Renaissance ideas spreading, the Protestant focus more on the individual than on the group, we start to see more focus on the individual person, okay, and not as the group. Okay, so the person standing out from the group became more important than the conformity of the group. And then our last one is, over time, after the initial bloodshed and violence of the Reformation, we do see the growth of religious tolerance. And as we mentioned earlier, that's basically the idea of freedom of religion, that whatever a person's religion is, you don't have the right to react violently against that person. Okay, their religion is okay to practice, your religion is okay to practice, and the two can agree to disagree on religious matters without doing so violently. Okay, and that's where our idea of religious tolerance is. Okay, and that concludes what we need to know for Standard 3C.